To anyone in the heat zone, that does kind of sound like an ice cream truck. So I apologize. You were in the wrong place and you should run out into the street looking both ways for that ice cream truck sound. Always follow that. So welcome. We are at PlatformCon. This is my first of 3 panels. If I'm going to be biased and pick a child, it's the one I'm most excited about because I am speaking with 3 amazing women that really just get this idea. We've been spending this time, like this idea in tech. We need a cloud transformation. We need a DevOps transformation. Transformation, big picture, big. We need to thrust whatever the week's generative AI code generation tool, even though that's what developers want to do and not have automated for them, but we want to just thrust this upon them across the whole company. Oh, Cursor's better this week. Let's do that one. Let's switch. Not exactly the best way to measure change and not exactly the best way to get change adopted in a way that gets feedback. We want incremental change, which I know y'all in the C-level listening are not loving that, but you need to listen. So I want to welcome our audience to please ask questions, and I'll remind you a couple times during. Let's see if this YouTube thing that's catching on is going to work and give us comments. Pleasant ones, please. You are part of an event and a code of conduct, so please be lovely on this here internet we're on. I would like to now welcome our amazing panelists, Lizzie, Kat, and Liz. That's just the order I see them in on my screen. I invite you to each introduce yourself. Liz, then Kat, then Lizzie we'll go with. If you want to please introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Liz. I'm the field CTO at Honeycomb. We are a observability startup, and we are also very much interested in developer productivity, as we think observability and developer productivity go hand in hand.
Yeah. Wonderful. I'm Kat. I'm a psychology PhD who fell in love with understanding why and how software teams work and how innovation works in the world. I'm also an intervention scientist, so I'm really interested in how we design for large-scale empirical evidence about the changes we want to make in the world, which is really hard in every domain, so don't feel alone. It's hard in health, it's hard in schools, and it's hard in software teams, but I think we can do it. And I build research teams to study the understudied a lot of the time. I lead a research consultancy called Catharsis.
Cool. And I'm Lizzie. I'm co-founder and CEO of Quotient. Quotient is a dev tool that discovers, prioritizes, and resolves the friction that slows down engineering teams. So we think about engineering productivity much more comprehensively, looking at both the system telemetry, but also developer sentiment and how that feeds into that feedback loop.
So what we're saying is that engineering is a science. So you can't improve what you can't measure.
I believe that there's a science and an art, and that everyone has the right to some scientific thinking in their lives. So
I'm already going to throw y'all a curveball or whatever the sports people say, because something I do on another podcast I host is who should be listening to this. So who would benefit from this conversation? I think is a good way to ground us.
I think that there's a number of stakeholders involved in the conversation about both measurement and iterating and improving. There is the team, I think first and foremost, like these are the folks that are most impacted by any friction in developer experience. And they probably have the biggest buy-in on what that change should be because the outcomes are improving their lives so that they can do their jobs more effectively. But I also think leadership is really important in this conversation. I made team go first because I actually think taking a more bottoms-up approach and thinking a lot more about what are those areas of friction that the team experiences is really critical, but then tying that into leadership and making sure they understand this is the friction, here's how it impacts your overall outcomes to your customer is a really great way to tie incentives together so that everybody wins.
Mm-hmm. Anyone have anything to add of other stakeholders maybe to get involved here?
I think the one that I might add here is the product team, right? Like it's not just an engineering concern. I think product cares very much, how are we actually delivering things? Can we actually deliver things faster? Like, what is it that people mean when they say that we have too much technical debt or we need to invest in the platform?
Mm-hmm. I would say I could make a pitch for so many because I just love the complexity of it. But there's one persona that comes to mind, and it's the person who ends up in my inbox because they realize that they have a different job than their job description, and it's really, building for other teams, or they're the really influential staff engineer who also cares a lot about development and became sort of the person for developer experience, or maybe they are like a formalized developer experience team, but there's some niche, some expertise that these people have that is so wonderful, but they also maybe feel really stressed, kind of alone, like there's a huge responsibility for being the person who decides how behavior change should work for their org. I think that's a lot for anybody, and I love to try to provide some help to those people. Maybe it's an infra team, looks different at different places, but that feeling is what gets me.
I mean, we are on PlatformCon, so it may be a platform engineering team, it may be a
True.
DevOps team, it may be at a startup, a customer success rep that's dealing with when the shit hits the fan and gets on them. So yeah. So we hope that if you're listening, you get value from this, but please ask questions that will help increase your value. So to start off, Lizzie, like when teams want to improve, how do they figure out what to improve first? Because obviously there's many, many, many things they could choose. And especially when we're talking about platform engineering team, they have an incredible, impressive backlog of requests.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the biggest traps is jumping into a solution really quickly before you understand what the real bottlenecks are. It is so tempting to listen to the loudest voice in a retro conversation, or maybe be biased by the problem that you experience most in your engineering team or when you were developing software regularly. But I think taking a more comprehensive lens and taking stock of what's happening in your systems is really critical. So I think to figure out where to improve first, you should start by triangulating different data points. There's obviously telemetry data, so understanding how your systems work, understanding how code reviews work, understanding how the team's velocity works, but then also overlaying developer sentiment data. So deep work, satisfaction with code reviews, the impact of technical debt. Like getting a good sense of all of that data will give you a sharper picture of where that friction exists and then how it's felt. And sometimes it can be counterintuitive. So a team might be shipping really fast, but because you got some of that telemetry data, you'll realize there's actually high burnout, and you'll find out that that's not really sustainable. So those are ways you can kind of figure out where to start first.
Kat, you want to add to that more?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you. I think a lot about this from two angles. Like when I'm consulting with engineering organizations, I think about what is our overall evidence strategy here. And often people will take this for granted. Like we will know when things work because it will just work, and that will be obvious. We will know when developers are happy because happiness will be obvious. Just a really actionable first piece of advice I give to people is outcome measures are very hard. It's very hard. It's an ongoing process to decide what should we be looking at as kind of our guiding light right now, and that will probably change over time. The thing that I do to try to break this down a little bit, in addition to, like, Lizzie gave a really great overview, I think, of the shape of data, there's a cultural piece that I consider a precondition to ever working with that data successfully. And that is leaders really taking stock of what they can change in the environment. I see a lot of places pigeonhole on maybe this thing matters a lot, but if you can't change it, then what good is it you tracking it? You find the thing that is important, but also malleable to you under your remit, under your responsibility as well. Because I think it's important to call out, when we're talking about measurement, there are things that's inappropriate to measure about the people in your company. You can't send them. You shouldn't be sending them home with biometrics about their sleep. There are laws about what you can and can't measure about human beings that we take really seriously in research. There's just inappropriate levels of things. You shouldn't be asking about their health experiences, even though that's a big part of developer experience. You can't ask if people are going through a health crisis or something like that, right? So what is in the scope of a leader's appropriate scrutiny? And I think it's things that are close and appropriate to the work. So do my developers feel motivated? What does that look like? And what can I change in the environment? And then I think there's a really important second half of that, which is the information loop from people closest to the work. So when we're designing an evidence strategy, how are we making this a strategy that we are co-designing with all of the people who it's really going to affect? And that is a principle of what we call community-based methods in social science, which is something that I love and deeply consider myself aligned to. So I think those are kind of two directions I try to push orgs in.
So Liz, I believe you are the person I've most heard the word telemetry from. Like, not on this call, I mean globally. So tell us more, Liz, about this telemetry.
I think some of the pieces of telemetry that we track about organizational health rather than about computer systems themselves. I know Kat mentioned you can't track employee sleep, but I do think it's important to track how often are you waking employees up, right? Like how often are you actually paging people out of working hours? Because we know that that generally has a negative impact on people's happiness if they keep on getting woken up night after night, right? So I think that's a really key thing to look at improving is, how can we make it so that people get into a state of flow when they are at work and that they can shut off when they're not at work? And then I think, the other piece here is you really want to make sure people know that they're not going to be penalized for what they report, right? Like, I think that can really, really skew your metrics if you have, this is our company's goal to improve this metric by, 10%. And, we're going to solve it by laying off the people who report negative scores, right? Like that's not going to encourage people to be honest.
Mm-hmm. So that brings like two questions that come that are kind of together. And I would love for each of you to answer, because Kat used the word inappropriate. So do we consider individual line metrics like appropriate or inappropriate? And then does it risk penalizing if it's anonymized versus de-anonymized? So how far down should we be measuring? And what are the risks or repercussions of that?
I have thoughts. So you need to measure things at the individual level to answer certain kinds of questions. You lose a lot of information if you don't. So, and sometimes, aggregation itself can be dangerous. So I don't mean that we open people up to scrutiny on every part of their work or something like that. But we found this when we looked at cycle time. If you're doing clumsy or simplified aggregation, you will just distort the numbers deeply. So it's actually scientifically necessary, statistically necessary for some questions to understand where the sources of variance are. And sometimes they're at that individual level. And we need to sometimes do that to protect individuals, to be able to show this is a change that's really seems to be coming from the team, or an impact that seems to be coming from the environment and not, or from the org, or from something that's shared across individuals, not from within the individual themselves. And that is, there's some questions we have about that. Like, for instance, is this person doing great harm to the people around them, or something like that is a question an organization sometimes needs to ask. So I think that the question of, there's two kinds of appropriate and inappropriate, and one is appropriate to the question that you think you're going to answer with this evidence. The other is, what are all the boundaries around us in an organization, legally, ethically? And I think there are many, many such boundaries, including who gets to look at that data? Should it be individual managers? As a scientist, I set up all kinds of structures to anonymize when we do look at individual data. And we set up things like, let's have an IRB if we're going to do a project that's going to mention something like, go ahead, Jennifer, sorry.
I was going to say, define that acronym, please.
Yeah. So an IRB is an institutional review board. It's very typical at all universities in the US. Pretty much have to have them if they run research. It's mandated by law, if you do human subjects research of a certain kind, that you need to have your research reviewed. And there's a whole set of rules about who reviews it, all kinds of cool things, actually, like your IRB review panel needs to be diverse. there needs to be someone who's from outside of your institution on it. And we set one up for my research lab over the last 3 years at a tech company, which is pretty unusual, not unknown completely, but we did that so that we had someone looking at every step of how are you collecting data and is there any risk to people? So where can we make sure that we're not exceeding that risk envelope? And where can we make sure that we're following the norms that other scientists say we should follow? So that's a little bit in the weeds there. But I will say, I hear this a lot from people, just that maybe the answer is that we never look at individual data, and you can make that decision in your org, but it will cut you off from certain questions, and it will, be a big loss of information. And there are constraints that come along with that. So I also think there are individual accountability questions, when we're dealing with humans in an organization. So a mixed stance from me.
Yeah, I was going to say, Lizzie, you have a tool that you're sending surveys out to developers. Can it be known at the individual level? Explain that.
Great question. And I think, Kat, I loved having you go first and share some of that, especially around like the loss of information that you get if you aren't able to go down to an individual level. We have mindfully and thoughtfully decided that trade-off was worth it because of how challenging it is for us to be able to assume a certain culture at a company where that data is going to be used for net positive things. So when we think about a platform team or a developer productivity team that's leveraging that data, like their incentives are generally aligned with how do I figure out the friction slowing down the entire engineering org? And then how do I take this data at whatever level it might come and use it to drive meaningful change in the areas that we want to make improvements? Unfortunately, when those data points can also be drilled down to an individual level, there's an incentive to start looking at which individuals contribute most. And Liz, you brought up that great example of like, let's improve our metrics by 20% by just firing the people at the bottom of it, right? I think it's so difficult to create those systems and cultures within a company. And so what we do is, in an effort to make sure that we are encouraging and incentivizing the fastest path to higher productivity in a way that is most sustainable for the teams, we actually make a concerted choice that we do anonymize that data, and we know there's a trade-off there. So the way that we balance for that trade-off is by allowing folks to offer sort of free text responses to clarify any perspective they have. And that way, like, we can get those data points on the fringe, but it's an opt-in by the folks who are experiencing it, as opposed to default assuming the good intentions.
And I think echoing what Lizzie said, right, like some of the best interventions that you can make, at least at a team that is getting started with all this stuff, is to focus on things that lift all of the boats, right? Like you want to decrease the cycle time, right? Like, I've been working a fair bit on our CI/CD systems, right? Like I very firmly believe that if you can get your CI/CD running in less than 10 minutes, ideally less than 5 minutes, right? Like that it has this massive uplift because it means people no longer are like, oh my God, the bill is so slow, or what if it flakes and I have to rerun it and now I've wasted 3 hours of work. Well, if you've wasted 5 minutes of work, okay, whatever, right? Like I think that there are kind of all these things that follow on from investing just in that core loop of how quickly do we get things into production.
Okay. And then now you mentioned CI/CD pipeline. There's just so many different metrics, like hundreds. I think the actual DORA report unto itself out of Google is about 150 questions. I haven't checked out the new one. It could be longer. There's going to be more Gen AI in there. Let's be real. But it's out this week. So that is one way that companies can anonymously evaluate and then benchmark themselves against different companies in the industry as a standard. But maybe cycle time's another one. Why is it, Liz, why is it so complex to measure the developer experience? Why are smaller changes better?
I think, right, like you want the system to be legible to people. You want people to feel comfort, and you don't cause people to feel comfort by like yanking the rug out from under them, right? So I think when we, in fact, I actually had a prospective client, I'm anonymizing this sufficiently, I think. I had a prospective client who told me, like, no, actually, now is not the right time for Honeycomb because we just did another major disruptive change to our teams. We cannot expect them to adopt 2 new tools in the span of 6 months, right? Like, I think that's the right decision, right? Like, to go incremental rather than to go for maximum gain as quickly as possible, right? Because you have to prioritize people feeling comfortable with the work that they're doing and having a feeling that they understand what's going on rather than just being in this kind of constant turmoil. Because when you are in constant turmoil, it creates a disincentive to learn the new thing because people are like, oh, that's just going to change in another 6 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
True.
Yeah.
I would I have a counterpoint to this, which I think is just another level to this, which I'm really curious for the panelists' thoughts. Some changes are different than others, right? Some changes are cultural signals. So sometimes a really big change is necessary, in my opinion, because it connects to a really big psychological need that people have.
Mm.
And I've been always really interested in my career as a social scientist in the times when we sort of say one thing but mean the other, and the hypocrisy that we can accidentally sometimes or on purpose signal in our environment. So an example of this is, I use this example a lot. There's a poster on the wall that says, everybody can learn here, and we love learning, but then you go to your manager and you ask for an extra week to learn some challenging piece of technology, and they just stomp on you, stomp on your feelings. So when I'm working with clients and orgs, I completely agree with what Liz is saying, that it puts people in a state of disruption. It puts them in a state of, it's very difficult to be throwing, and you're sending them a message, maybe no change is reliable. You can't expect us to commit to anything. I also tell people, you cannot be in a state of nihilism either. Like, oh, we can't make it a big change ever. I do believe people are crafting and changing culture all the time. And sometimes if there's a massive cultural boulder in the way that we need to fix, and it is a big challenge for the org, maybe that is where all of our energy should go. And so I try to work with clients sometimes to think about a hierarchy, of needs essentially for their eng org and say, listen, I know you thought you were going to make all these little platform decisions or whatever, but it turns out what we need to solve is this feeling developers have that they can't learn. And that's a big challenge, but we're going to do it, So that's kind of the world I like to live in.
I think what's really interesting, I wonder if like the kind of common thread between those two is the buy-in that you're getting. It almost sounds like on both sides, there's a story of like a time when the team actually doesn't have buy-in to two massive investments in a 6-month span versus Kat, in your example, when there might be more buy-in on the team side to say, hey, maybe we should just throw this whole thing away. I think what's also really interesting is so commonly when we think about developer productivity, like the most, I think just because it's been around for so long, like those DORA 4 metrics are like the thing people look at as that signal of whether change should be happening and what that change should be. And I think that that's like a really great framework, that specifically the DORA 4 for looking at the platform or DevOps layer and like thinking about systems that impact multiple different developer teams. But it does make it a little bit more difficult to understand where some of those more socio-technical aspects of a team lie. So, 2 teams can have similar deployment frequency, but then they have wildly different collaboration dynamics, review processes, team morale, like requirements gathering. And I think that's been the core challenge with developer experience is we've been so hung up on just these 4 metrics as if they are the thing to look at, when actually there's a much broader world of metrics and ways to look at where we should be making investments and when a change should be maybe seismic or very incremental. There's a case for both. And I think over in the long term, I think the incremental ends up being what compounds much larger over time. But sometimes you do just need those explosive big changes.
I love what you said about that one, right? Like it's you can get teams to do large disruptive changes if you explain to them why it's being done and how it's going to benefit them.
Platform is a product mindset. Your
Correct.
Employees should be kind of your customers that you are responsible for. It just kind of got lost along the way that because there's a new change in tax law or because you're no longer responsible for employees. I just want to do my journalistic service for those that maybe don't know the DORA metrics. Our deployment frequency, lead time to change, change failure rate and mean time to restore, which are things I don't think we disagree. You should measure these. There are about 150 questions on DORA. We get stuck on those and maybe reliability in there, or cybersecurity sometimes. There are a lot of questions, including questions about culture. So I do invite, it is a free activity. You can download a PDF and do it. You don't have to. You can contribute to the survey, and that is data I as a journalist love to read through. But I do think it is interesting questions to at least ask once a year and to check in. But we've been talking about this idea. We're advocating for smaller changes. And I think in allegedly economically tighter times, again, it feels all false, but a smaller change is probably something easier to get budget for too. So that could be something compelling on the call. We have a comment in the chat. Hi, Louis B. It's public, so I can say your name on YouTube. So they have said, in my understanding, developer experience initiatives can compete with goals that may be easier to draw lines to well-understood numbers like revenue. Are there any reliable or go-to methods to connect DevX, which is one of the many abbreviations for developer experience goals, outcomes that don't get waved away as wishy-washy by more metrics-oriented peers in leadership? I would like to speak on behalf of everybody but me on this call, but this is a very metrics-oriented call. Not so much me, but the rest of y'all are deeply. But what would be an example of one of those smaller measurable changes that also early wins helps you get buy-in faster, right?
I could speak to this a little. Oh, go ahead, Liz.
No, please, go ahead, Kat. I need some time to formulate that thought anyway.
Awesome. Okay, I'll try to platform for you. I live in this world. Okay, like everybody just looks at you when you're a scientist and they say, "Wow, look at the world right now." We're asking, "What is the ROI of science? Does your stuff connect to money?" The funniest thing for me is my stuff connects to money all the time. Actually, a lot of money, but you have to make it legible to people. You have to give them a vocabulary. One of the key things is you have to show the cost of not doing the improvement. So this probably resonate with all the info people and platform people, but we do research work that often gets labeled feelings and, nice to have and culture and all this stuff. And actually it ties into the deepest parts of where a business is getting value. So there are methods from behavioral science to say, are people actually in a learning culture? If you measure learning culture, as I've done even in my research projects, it connects to how productive they say they're able to be in that moment. So, if your org cares about the language of productivity, there are even very scrappy, attainable measures. I've worked with nonprofits who have to prove that their work doing health education has merit to the government, has to prove that it benefits a community. You can translate that stuff into dollars. And sometimes it's, you can go all the way from back of the napkin, earnest community group, 3 people in a room, which I've done, all the way up to massive efficacy scale work that we do in education. I was on a project where we had half of the junior high school students in the United States, and we showed that if we invested in this free open online SAT platform, it was via Khan Academy in a partnership with College Board at the time, we can do this complicated statistical modeling to show, every moment they engage in the platform in these ways and use their time in this way translates to a score gain of this amount. So there's all kinds of people out there. I think that actually engineering organizations should probably consider spending like just the teeniest bit of budget on giving yourself a behavioral scientist or someone who works in this area, so you're not dumping this on the plate of some poor, stressed out engineer trying to do this calculation. Find us, those of us who've had to do this kind of work all the time. But that's my quick overview pitch. I profoundly think that the kind of work we're talking about does connect to money and does connect a lot of the time also to the inverse, to organizations hemorrhaging money, and they don't know it. So an example is, we studied code review anxiety, which a lot of people reacted to like, that's just feelings, how nice, help the junior developers, whatever. No, code review anxiety affects people across the experience spectrum. We see a 40% increase in the likelihood of avoiding technical work like code reviews that you need to keep your engineering organization functional. So meeting the human need, actually helping make your code review process better, connects to maybe a bigger improvement than almost anything you could do as a leader. That's an ambitious pitch, but I think these DevX initiatives are really important.
Wow.
It's been really fascinating watching the kind of conversation around observability, right? Because people have been like, oh, this is a 30% tax on my AWS bill. And I'm like, no, it is not a tax. It is an investment, right? Like, and I think people are misconceiving it as a fraction of their AWS bill rather than an investment in their people, right? Like, and I think this is why in the SRE world that I'm from, right, like we talk about service level objectives, yes, for measuring service reliability, but we also talk about toil, right? Toil being the percentage of time that you spend doing break fix work or other unplanned work that does not directly contribute towards feature progress, right? Like, and when you are spending more than 40% of your time on toil, then that starts compounding, right? Then you're suddenly doing more break fix work just to keep the system working, and now you're not able to kind of pay down and kind of reduce the amount of break fix work that you're doing, right? So I think that when you look at the massive amount of money that people are spending on salaries, right? And you're realizing, wait a second, if I could save every developer, 5 hours a week, right? Like if we could spend 5 hours less in incident review and 5 hours less in working incidents every week, right? Like that suddenly starts to resonate with people because they realize, hey, wait a second, I'm spending all this money on salaries. That being said, right, like, that only works if a leader actually can see what they can be doing instead with that time of their developers. If the leader's just like, oh, now you're saying that to realize any savings, I have to lay off 5% of my engineers. And it's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, look at all the things that are currently falling below the red line on your projects list. You could be doing those things too.
Why is it
I love that.
Yeah. Why is it always, oh, yay, we can cut heads? We acknowledge that this is money because engineers are paid a huge amount compared to other jobs, and engineer salaries are likely one of your larger expenses in most companies. Yeah. But we are not arguing to fire engineers. We're arguing don't have them doing boring shit they don't want to do anyway.
Yeah, I would also both answers were phenomenal. And I will just say directly, if anyone who's listening to this is like, I still need to figure out how to do that, just contact me. We do this all the time for companies. And we look at these two primary drivers, which is how much revenue does it add to your top line if you can have a guarantee on your project meeting its timelines, or you can push up the project deadlines. And then conversely, how much are you basically able to save by, instead of needing to grow your engineering team by X amount, you can actually just leverage the team you have that's been struggling with that toilsome work that Liz was just referencing. So I think the nice counterpoint to today's time is that because of the advent of AI, we need to be moving faster than ever as an engineering org. And my hope is that that is leading engineering organizations and just broadly companies to understand we have to increase our pace now. And so it's not about how we can, cut spend in engineering by just, firing engineers. It's about how do we take this unit, this performant org, and accelerate them because the world around us is moving a lot faster.
Yeah, I'd love to name something that I'm hearing emerging across this conversation, which is a real mindset shift from developers are fungible, individual little units. They're like things on an assembly line, into this perspective that is, you have an ecosystem, you have this organization. A layoff is also an intervention on the organization. And we have tons of evidence about what that so go into the coldest, hardest, money-driven room. I've argued in front of boards and with CEOs about this kind of thing where people's experience and feelings don't matter. You can still use these skills of intervention science to say, let us look truly at what the layoff costs us, actually, because there is a ton of evidence about what layoffs don't solve. And I believe we know that software development is highly collaborative, social. There's a problem-solving culture that's happening in your org. And if you're just taking a pickaxe to that culture all the time, surprise, you're going to degrade it. And, it's a big challenge to make that visible. But we all across our various answers have tried to shift the perspective to how can we evaluate what the org's doing? How can we turn the spotlight of measurement back on leadership, back on the practices we're putting in place? I think that's a beautiful frame of mind. And I'm going to say something a little cheeky, which is we brought up benchmarks. I'm not a huge fan of external compare yourself to another org benchmark. I don't think the engineering is mature enough in how it measures things. Even with Dora, I find Dora for like an interesting observational project, an interesting cluster of people's perceptions about what their orgs are doing. But as you pointed out, I think a couple of people pointed out the same average of 5 could mean very different things in a different org. And everything that our last couple answers were circling around was how do we develop our own pre and post understanding for ourselves, our own within organization change. That to me is a lot less misleading. It's the place where you can do the work to bring in the context, do the work to understand why is this our deployment cadence. And I mean, we all know you could go to one company and a certain average number is great, and go to another company and a certain average number actually means something very alarming. So I just find those benchmark approaches very limited.
Okay. And so we know each company is different and we need to look at it a different way, though I do think there's definitely, we all like to compare to other people. That's just the society we're in. So benchmarking will never go away. But we need to do things our own way within our own company. So how do we go about designing those smaller cyclical experiments or interventions to craft better cultures for software teams? And I think those often we need to also say maybe not productivity, but maybe productivity that the cultures drive that. So how do we go about crafting in the last few minutes we have in this conversation? How do we go about crafting an experiment? Lizzie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think we always recommend that folks start with some sort of hypothesis and understanding where do you believe that change should be going towards. And, of course, all the disclaimers about assuming you have all the right information and you were able to sort of use that to understand how your team is doing. For example, you could say something like, we think interruptions are hurting our overall focus time, and that's what's impacting our ability to deliver the things that we've committed to. So one way that we can craft an intervention, or to think of a way that we can sort of address it with an action, is a no meeting experiment for 2 weeks, right? Using tools or processes to sort of set up these lightweight experiments, making sure you have that data collection happening, before and after, ideally really continuously. And
what example of data to collect?
Great question. So if we're talking, for example, about deep work, you might want to be looking at system telemetry that's just telling you, how often are issues making it over the finish line, how often are code reviews making it through the finish line, what is the overall cycle time? And then you would want to be maybe looking at some of the developer sentiment around that. So what's the perception around deep work? How are people feeling about their level of scheduled interruptions and unscheduled interruptions? So the meetings you have on your calendar versus the Slack pings that you're getting all day long, right? Capture the before, run that 2-week experiment or maybe month-long experiment, and then look at the afters. And what we often find actually is that sentiment-based data can be a really great leading indicator, and telemetry data tends to follow. And what I really mean by that is developers will feel that things are getting better, and then the data is going to start showing that. But if you just ask engineers, hey, is this helping you focus more and get more of your work done? Oftentimes you'll get that early signal, that buy-in, it's getting a lot better. And then you'll start to see those telemetry signals really follow. And so doing those continuous improvement cycles, I think, is really where change starts to compound on itself and add value to the organization.
Okay. Kat, you love an experiment.
Yeah. I do. I think there's a whole range of levels to this, right? So there's the time when you maybe could invest entirely in a full intervention program, hire a researcher or something like that. But then there's also the scrappy times. I mean, Lizzie gave I would completely agree with that overview. One thing I think that trips people up is often actually truly measuring over time and not just sort of idealizing, imagining that we're going to and then forgetting to do it. And, so there's a quality of saying, I'm actually going to wait. I'm going to deploy something into this environment, and then I'm going to give it enough time to make a change. That's very hard for leaders. I will say that's very hard if you're getting pressure about it. So coming up with a plan, a pre-plan to really say, it's not reasonable to expect my software developers to suddenly change their behaviors within 2 days, enough to show up in these metrics. Like, what is the time frame that truly is rational for some of these interventions? To get help with this, like, don't reinvent the wheel. Look at other places we can learn about interventions, learn about the expected size of these things. Doing behavior change, which is really what we're doing when we're trying to change how people work, is very hard, does take a long time. I think about inviting software teams in a lot sooner in the process, even in your developer experience surveys, not just have them always be reactively reporting, but build in a little co-design, like say, hey, open text, what do you think we're not measuring here? Where do you see a change we haven't imagined? What did you see as an intervention that I wouldn't have even thought of that? And you'll get, I think, a ton of really productive, interesting conversation from doing that sort of thing. And then I think too, continuing to design our outcome measures, continuing to ask ourselves, are we just defaulting to an outcome measure because it seemed like the thing to do at the time, but it's not really convincing us or satisfying us? Actually, we have all these doubts about it. So I do a lot of continuous design of outcome. Those are kind of the quick things I would say.
Okay.
Ed and Lizzie, I have a question for you. If we're saying we're going to be doing all of these things, smaller, more incrementally, but it takes time to evaluate the results, how do you avoid confounding your results, right? Like, what happens if you decide that you want to do 5 different things in sequence? There's this long trailing effect. How do you know which one of those 5 things worked?
You need a good design. You need a really good blocked, stratified, experimental design. I mean, I don't think people bring in enough causal inference methods or kind of think about the natural experiments that occur inside their organizations. Probably a lot of Lizzie's bread and butter is helping people understand their orgs in the first place, and then, I won't speak for you, but that's where my head goes.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too is understanding what is the effort of those changes too. So sometimes we do find that organizations have made 2 or 3 different changes within a given time period, and then we see that the data is showing some statistically significant improvements in their overall productivity, and they come to us and say, which one of these things did it? And we're like, well, what is the impact of doing all of these things right now? Do you find that it is all additive to your culture and to your ability to be effective? And oftentimes they're like, oh yeah, they're all great. We're like, great. Then maybe if you need to make changes, then let's track that. But it's okay if it's, confluence of things led to a change. I'm actually go ahead, Kat.
Oh, I was just going to mention something that might be useful, which is, first of all, you can think about having control groups, which people don't do enough. What we compare
depends
to
on
what
your
really
org
matters.
size, right? You can do a control group if you've got 10 teams. If you've got 1 team or 5 teams, it's a little harder.
Well, you could do within person experiment if you give yourself enough data over time. But these are super good. Confound is a huge issue in all kinds of investigation. We'll always be running into it. A quick fallacy story that I think people find really useful is, imagine you have a little grasshopper. I'm sorry, it's going to be a little gnarly, but you have a little grasshopper and you want to know what helps the grasshopper walk, and you pull off one leg and the grasshopper can still walk. And you're like, okay, well, it wasn't that leg. And then you pull off the next leg and the grasshopper can still walk, right? And you do it until you pull off a leg and the grasshopper falls down and you're like, this is the leg. This is the reason for walking, right? So this is a problem that I see orgs fall into all the time. Understanding what causes what is very complicated.
But I think something we found with generative AI, we don't know that it's necessarily actually made developers more productive. It's reduced toil. We know it helps. It's very effective in documentation. That seems across the board. Makes sense. Gen AI is good at explaining things back to you.
Wait a second. I disagree with that. It's good at generating documentation, but the documentation is not the understanding.
Okay, fair enough. No, it's not understanding, but it's good at explaining complexity a bit. It's better than writing code, we know. But developers have this innate perception of productivity, whether it's numerical or not, based on that. And we know perception of productivity can directly affect productivity. So when in doubt is not the best metric. Just asking your developer how they feel week to week. Do they feel more or less productive? How this tool responds to people, makes that change, things like that. When in doubt, is the best metric something you ask your developer or something you're pulling out of the system, or both? Real quick, let's end on that. Probably could be a whole hour-long talk.
Yeah, I'll try to give a really like high-level thought here, because we look at this all the time. I would say, Jennifer, your like kind of instinct there is totally correct. Like, we have found that understanding impact can go in a number of different ways. It's how developers are perceiving the experiences. How is it improving their overall processes? And is it being used to address the pain points they have? I think, every organization should try, code writing, whether it's Cursor or Copilot or whatever else, but that's often not in the top 5 greatest areas of toil for an engineering team. There are a ton of other places. And so what we look at is not just how is it impacting these metrics, but also what is the overall usage across different areas of the software development lifecycle, and is AI being used to solve those real pain points? Some of that can be done through system metrics, some of it can be done through developer sentiment data, but I think like that instinct is right. We need to be checking in with engineers, not just throwing licenses for licenses' sake and setting goals around 90% of people use the licenses, but actually understanding where are the areas of toil, what telemetry do we have put in place, and how is it actually making our engineering teams more productive?
Liz? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think, if you have a screwdriver, it's great at screwing in screws. It's not so great for pounding in nails. So, we can't just tell people just use the damn screwdriver, right? Like if they don't have a screw-shaped problem. But I think the way that you help people identify screw-shaped problems is in the earlier stages of technology adoption is to have people share stories of where did it help them, where did it not help them, so that we can learn together about what works best in our context, in our org.
That's beautiful. And Kat, anything else to add on that?
I love that, Liz. You really helped me with that last answer. Like, I think that I try to shift people from productivity to problem solving. So can we understand how developers are problem solving in our org? And I think there's 2 things mixed up a little bit here. One is the best tactic to learn from developers? And the other is the best tactic to learn from developers' satisfaction? Or, and I agree with the first and not the second. Satisfaction is a dangerous measure, because a homogenous organization might be completely satisfied with a culture of exclusion, or people might be deeply satisfied with something that's really doing them long-term damage. We are really accurate observers of a lot of parts of our experience, but we also have a lot of very understandable reasons we get misled. We can't always watch our own learning. This is a really famous thing. You don't really let kids just choose to only work on the things that they find very easy. So developers are not children. I didn't mean to go there, but that's just my background because I did developmental psych. So I believe that the best starting place is soliciting that deeply important information from the people doing the work, exactly as Liz says. I do think that we need to find better measures than happiness or satisfaction, find richer measures that connect directly to the things that are under our responsibility as we craft organizations and work together. And to me, those are things like, are people able to access their best problem-solving selves? Is human well-being being protected, because these are human beings that we're counting on their problem-solving? And certain questions about the quality of that problem-solving.
Yeah. And it's just about remembering that these are creative workers. They are not of the 80s that are just following code and pushing buttons. This is a creative job. So reduce that toil, increase their capacity to a limit of human capability for creativity. I would like to say thank you to PlatformCon, because obviously accepted this panel. They're exceptional, and that's awesome. And thank you so much, Lizzie, Kat, and Liz. And thank you, audience. We all have quite not that common names. So I think you can easily find all of us on LinkedIn if you want to continue the conversation there. we'll see if we actually check the comments on the later video more than once on YouTube, but it's the start of conversations. And definitely, I do recommend you add in the comments the questions you're asking, the measurements you're taking, because it is something measurable, even though it's human beings. These human, maybe not the individual always, but maybe sometimes, but it also adds a lot to create a safe environment where people can be asked questions and you show interest in their well-being. So that has an effect unto itself. Thank you all so much and have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.